But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens.
So
are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Dr. Richard McNeil-Willson, who is a research fellow at the European University Institute, as well as a postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University in The Hague. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
Hi, it's super to be here.
Just to begin with, one of your areas of expertise is PREVENT, the UK government's counter-terrorism initiative. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
So yes, I work a lot looking at the development of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. One of the most important areas I think that I work on is around the development of PREVENT, which is a part of the UK counter-terrorism strategy. So with sort of the attack in 2005, the London bombings, the 2006 transatlantic aeroplane plot, the Tiger plot, and the Glasgow City Airport of bombing of 2007, we had this sort of big drive towards developing a large counter-terrorism strategy in the UK. And they sort of developed this contest strategy, which has 4 strands: protect, pursue, prepare, and prevent. When all of this was sort of developed in the mid-2000s, PREVENT, which is sort of the more broader sort of community-focused side of it, was much smaller. It's sort of been described as the younger brother of the 4 pillars of contest in the UK. But since then, it's sort of taken on a life of its own. It's become very centralized within UK counter-terrorism and now counter-extremism approaches. And it's also been something that we've seen replicated within the European models of responding to counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. A lot of the work of PREVENT is very broad in its approach, in its understanding of terrorism and of extremism. And as a result, it's causing sort of lots of trouble, lots of controversy in the UK and internationally, in terms of its sort of large scale approach, often kind of focusing on minority communities, on Muslim communities, leading to the overrepresentation of minority communities in discussions around terrorism and responses to terrorism. So that's sort of a broad kind of overview of PREVENT as it stands.
PREVENT's been in the news a little bit lately because of a new podcast by Serial and the New York Times, looking at how this incident, the Trojan Horse affair, or the Trojan Horse hoax, depending on who you talk to about it, which was this incident that involved fake letters being sent to authorities alleging a Trojan Horse effort by Muslims to take over Britain's schools, how it informed the strategy and how it applies in schools. Have you had a chance to listen to the podcast, and what did you think of it?
I have had a chance to listen to the podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, even as someone who works in this field, spending a lot of time sort of researching in this field, I was shocked by simply sort of how balmy the letter is, some of the things that happened around it, how it sort of ties into very kind of localized dispute within a school, concerns about jobs, and how this sort of has spiraled outwards and been sort of deliberately picked up and manipulated to be used by national politicians in the UK. This sort of period, 2014, 2015, is a very important time in PREVENT as well. So that the Trojan Horse hoax sort of feeds into a lot of concern around violent extremism, developing concern around violent extremism. And what the Trojan Horse hoax did and the way it was used, it sort of helped to kind of turbocharge a lot of stuff of PREVENT and embed it within local communities more, and particularly embed it within educational institutions a lot more. So you had the sort of 2015 PREVENT duty came in the UK, which meant that schools, it meant that hospitals, it meant that social services, it meant that prisons, all kind of manner of social services and social workers had to embed counter-terrorism and counter-extremism approaches within their work as an obligation. So you had teachers having to make sure that they were kind of keeping an eye on children, reporting if they saw instances of extremism, having this legal obligation and legal duty to report on them in terms of spotting instances of extremism. Now, when we talk about extremism, it's of course a very, very difficult term to get a handle on. And this is kind of why I find it so interesting to look at. It's a very kind of legally and discursively fluid term. I mean, terrorism, of course, is highly controversial, but there's an action element involved and a legally defined consequence. But when you sort of come to looking at extremism, of course, extremism is not well defined. It's not defined in law. It's not illegal in many countries. And when you have this requirement of teachers, of doctors, of social workers, of prison guards to look out for instances of extremism, it's very difficult, of course, for them to identify. It's very difficult for anyone to identify, even someone who's been working in the field for decades. So you often have this kind of reliance on stereotypes. You have this reliance on not a lot of information. And of course, naturally, it leads to instances of hugely disproportionate instances of Muslims and minorities being reported to prevent, and essentially kind of facing this suspicion within particularly places where they are vulnerable in terms of schools, in terms of hospitals, where they can face suspicion and can be reported to prevent on very small, very inconsequential articulations of faith or discussion.
Well, what do you understand to be the relationship between these kinds of state technologies, counter-terrorism and colonialism?
I think it's really important that we kind of look as well at the global architectures of counter-terrorism and how they interact with each other. I think there's a very important discussion that has to be had around the link between counter-terrorism and colonialism. Because a lot of current counter-terrorism development, the way in which counter-terrorism has been developed, it's had to respond very quickly. Policymakers have responded very quickly to instances of violence, and they've drawn on the history that they have. They've drawn on other approaches towards the subjugation of violence. And sometimes that has inevitably come from a colonial context. So with the development of counter-terrorism, for instance, in the 2000s, the UK drew on Northern Ireland, on the suppression of Republican communities in Northern Ireland, on settler colonial approaches in Northern Ireland that it had developed, to cast itself as sort of a leader in countering terrorism. We see the same thing in the state of Israel, for instance, who has often kind of developed this idea of them being the sort of the canary down the coal mine in terms of responding to so-called Islamic terrorism, jihadi terrorism, because they have this settler colonial history that they can draw upon. And it's when you start to look at this, you see sort of the very racialized nature of counterterrorism. Now, of course, in recent years, counterterrorism has attempted to sort of move away from this racialization and cast itself as looking at all forms of extremism and all forms of terrorism and left and right. But you still have this inherent nature that it's come through that process from 9/11 onwards. It's drawn on global racial trends. And as part of that, inevitably, you still have this casting of terrorism as being associated with Muslimness, with being associated with Muslim countries. So I think whilst it's very important to see sort of 2001 as a big moment and 9/11 as a big moment in the development of terrorism, there's a very long history that sort of goes back that we can see going back many years. And we have to account for those long kind of racial trends that exist in different countries.
I mean, in terms of the terms and concepts that are used in describing, I guess, violent actors or potentially violent actors, it was just a couple of years ago that the Mike Burgess, who's the director of ASIO, put the case that there needed to be a change in terminology. And ASIO now officially employs two main categories: religiously motivated violent extremism and ideologically motivated violent extremism. Is that just a change in the, is that a superficial change, or do you think that reflects a change in how the state views this kind of phenomenon?
I think there has been a shift in discussions on terrorism, which have attempted to kind of bring in the different kinds of terrorism, different discussions around it, account for different factors. I think it's fairly superficial, personally. And I think it's very difficult to understand that difference between religious terrorism and ideological terrorism. I think there's some very sort of strange categorizations that you have that are developing within policy, within responses towards terrorism. And actually, if you look at a lot of prevent figures, for instance, in the UK, overwhelmingly, the majority now are from sort of mixed ideological backgrounds. Now, there's not a lot of explanation as to what mixed ideological backgrounds means. And of course, there's sort of different trends that are going on in terms of concerns around violence. But I think a lot of this is cosmetic, and I don't think a lot of this really gets to the heart of processes that are taking place. The fact that we have this idea of sort of religious terrorism as sort of one group and ideological terrorism as another group, I think is very problematic. I think a lot of the terminology is very difficult to comprehend and to use. And I think that's actually what we're starting to see. It's not so much a sort of a recognition that there's so many different kinds of terrorism and so many different kinds of extremism. It's actually really just tackling the fact that so many of these terms are so broad and so difficult and so unusable.
It seems like with a lot of terrorism that there's quite a bit of religiously motivated terrorism that is, derived from some sort of foreign relations issue, and quite a lot of the ideologically motivated terrorism is often derived from, a Christian fundamentalism, but that's not how they're defined.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's very interesting how there has been more concern around right-wing terrorism, around concerns around the far right, particularly obviously in Western countries. And I think that sort of speaks into that discussion there. But a lot of this is superficial, and I think there's a lot of concern within those who study long-term processes of counter-terrorism and the development of countering violent extremism, that the focus on the far right that's sort of come in is not particularly deep. It's using tools that are not particularly effective, and it's actually just helping to propagate existing counter-terrorism policy, which is generally focused towards Muslims and is still having a hugely disproportionate impact on Muslims and minority communities, on migration from Middle East and African countries, for instance. And actually this focus on the far right, or this kind of discussion on the far right, is not done effectively, is not done enough. And certainly there isn't a kind of an understanding of the way in which governments can help to kind of feed into the development of the far right, how counterterrorism itself and the securitizing of Muslims can help to feed in to the growth of the far right itself. I think there's this big blind spot that's not being addressed properly, because it's not really in the interest of a lot of government policy, of course, to examine the role that governments play, that authorities play, in exacerbating the growth of the far right, particularly in Western countries.
Well, speaking of the Academy, the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right has recently withdrawn an essay by a former CAR scholar which outlined the dangers of anti-fascism. What, if anything, does that incident tell us about counter-terrorism and the Academy?
I'm really glad you brought this incident up, because I think it's a really interesting example of where sort of far right scholarship needs to really critically needs to engage with some kind of the critical scholarship, critical terrorism scholarship, critical security scholarship that's going on at the moment. Within a lot, it's great to see the development of discussion around the far right, of research into the far right. With regards to CAR, I think there's some absolutely fantastic scholars who I know very well, who are great friends and great colleagues who work with CAR. And I've always kind of kept my distance slightly from CAR and felt that whilst they were a part of the sort of the landscape of academia and research, there was a lot of problems within them. And particularly CAR had always sort of, from its beginning, it had prevent practitioners, it had people very close to governments, and some very kind of problematic and quite controversial policies and approaches towards counterterrorism. Individuals involved with that were embedded in the heart of CAR from the beginning as sort of practitioner fellows. I think that's very that's very interesting that obviously the publication of this CAR article, the impact and the sort of the fallout that's had, that it led to attacks from the far right and the radical right on scholars, particularly on young women scholars working in the field. It speaks to the danger of having practitioners and people very much linked and involved in government responses to terrorism within the academia, because you end up essentially perpetuating and giving a lot of space and platform to authority approaches towards counterterrorism, which are not necessarily in the interest of the security of the community, but interest in the security of the state. I think you have to be really careful about this. And there's been a lot of criticism from critical terrorism scholars towards some approaches towards the far right, because, of course, responses to far right build out of responses towards so-called Muslim terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and that there isn't enough critical responses and critical understanding of how counterterrorism can interact with the far right, can help to perpetuate the far right. And we see in this article, an article on, within a center on looking at the radical right within the sort of CVE field, essentially stoking and enabling processes of the far and radical right. And that really, that has to be understood, that has to be untangled. There has to be more kind of discussion between critical scholars and between those looking at the far right. And I think because, governments have been so slow to respond to the far right, Europe has been so slow to respond to the far right, that sometimes when scholars see something happening against the far right in government, they're like, great, this is fantastic, we have a response to the far right, without sometimes seeing how this may impact on minority communities, how this might impact on race, how this might exacerbate concerns about counterterrorism that exist. I think CAR is a great example of where that can go wrong and where more dialogue needs to take place.
You're listening to Yana Passaran on 3CR 855 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Richard McNeil-Willson about CVE.
Richard, would you consider this to be an example of one of the outcomes of the securitization of these sorts of issues? One of the things I'm thinking of in this context is, in terms of the relationship between the academy or intellectuals and the state, is one of the things that the state or government agencies have that provides a distinct advantage is resources. If you want your research to be funded, well, you have limited avenues through which to pursue financial support. This places some scholars in a difficult position. But more broadly, there's a kind of, it seems to be the case that within the academic discourse, one tendency is towards the securitization of discourse, of dialogue around these matters. So there's a kind of, on the one level, an immediate kind of material interest provided to some for exploring approaches to examining these questions, which are more closely aligned to state interest or state security. And on the other, on a broader level, there's a tendency to, I guess, look at a whole range of social issues from a securitizing perspective. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, can you talk a little bit more about securitization and how it might impact upon the study of the far right or counterterrorism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've done a brilliant job just there. Yeah, and I think really summed it up very well. I mean, certainly there's so much resources, as you said, that come from the state, that come from having this certain kind of security lens, putting this certain security lens on issues. There's encouragement for particularly like young scholars to join groups that may be implicated within security and securitization. And I can see, I can see why, and of course, the discussion around CAR sort of fits broadly within that. And certainly it has huge implications for academia, and this has started to be studied. There's a lot of resources that are pumped into security and into securitization processes, and this has big impacts on academia. And it's very difficult, of course, to push against it. It's very difficult to take a non-security approach or a counter-securitized approach towards these issues. And as a result, you do have the securitization of various new different fields and the study of these fields through a policy approach. And there's a great quote which helps you to kind of rethink the approach towards violent extremism, towards studying terrorism, rather to not think yourself as a firefighter responding to terrorism, but a student of combustion. So you're trying to understand what the processes are behind terrorism, behind extremism, behind political violence, but not implicate yourself so fully in the process as you are part of the firefighting response against it. And I've always tried to kind of center that in my work and understand the processes behind terrorism, but not be drawn too far into determining what the response should be and what better policy should be and become part of that sort of policy making machine.
Richard, you recently published a paper looking at the repression of Crimean Muslims by the Russian state, and particularly examining the ways in which the language of counter-terrorism and CVE has been appropriated as part of that repression. Could you speak a little bit about what you found when you looked into that? And perhaps also, I think there might be some relevance to recent events, particularly the way in which one of the pretexts for war is the denazification of Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I recently have a study out in Intersections, put together by some great friends of mine, looking at the repression of Crimean Muslim activism in Russia. It's a very interesting, it's a very timely study, actually, as it turns out, far more timely than I would have hoped. And what it shows, doing lots of research interviews with Crimean activists, pro-democracy activists, particularly, and community activists and Islamic activists as well, because Crimea has a large Muslim Tatar population. The way in which a lot of democracy protests, democracy activism has been repressed in Crimea is through the use of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism by Russian authorities. And again, you see that racialization process because there's large Muslim communities within Crimea. It's meant that there's been an opportunity by Russian authorities to frame the repression of democracy in Crimea as being part of the war on terror and saying, well, look, here we have these troublemakers. Here we have Muslims. Here we have terrorism going on, terrorism against authority. And as a response, we need to crack down on it. And it's been very difficult for Western states to counter some of those lines, because of course Russia can then say, well look, we're countering terrorism. We're concerned about Islamic terrorism just as much as you are, and we're kind of putting these processes in place to stop it. So why are you kind of pushing back against this? And of course, this takes place within the wider thread of now the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we can see how powerful that narrative is of the war on terror and how it's being used by authoritarian states in authoritarian settings and how it's being wielded against democratic activism. In Crimea, Crimean Tatars have faced so many different kind of counter-terror linked repression. They faced administrative prosecution, enforced disappearances. They've been incarcerated and subject to sort of counter-terrorism training and approaches, and put into sort of rehabilitation centers for those who fall under the influence of extremists. So we can see this language coming through very powerfully. And it's of course not just a language that's used in Crimea. It's also used more broadly within the Russian context and the invasion of Ukraine. Putin, for instance, cited terrorists and extremists as a reason for these current operations, the current full invasion of Ukraine. So much of the discussion around Ukraine from a Russian point of view has sought to cast Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, as being beholden to terrorism and extremists. We also, of course, have this discussion on denazification, the concern that Ukraine is beholden to Nazi interests or is run by Nazi groups. The influence of the Azov battalion, for instance, in the Ukrainian military, and the implications that has for the Ukrainian state. It's very difficult, of course. These arguments are very powerful, and they sit within globally entrenched discussions on the war on terrorism. But I think we need to be very careful the impact that discussions on countering terrorism have on global security, on the architecture of global security. And we can see this. We see it being used. We see it used by authoritarian states. We see it being used in China, for instance, as well, towards Muslim minorities. And we see it not just in Ukraine, but to justify various actions by Russia against foreign states and against foreign governments. It's really important not to kind of fall into that discussion and that sort of that trap too deeply. Of course, there are elements that there are concerns about in Ukraine. Of course, there are groups that have some influence in Ukraine that have Nazi links, neo-Nazi links. Within context, though, of course, if we're simply just talking about Nazis and Nazification, I mean, certainly there's huge concern about Nazi groups in Russia, and the sort of the international presence of Nazi groups in Russia as well, the links they have to groups like the Nordic resistance movement and neo-Nazi groups in the Nordics. neo-Nazi groups in Italy, elsewhere in Europe, even in the US. To me, the discussion around the denazification of Ukraine, of course, to me, it holds no weight. But it's very interesting, of course, because this focus on the very far right is often used by states as a way of distracting from very far right, hard right policies and certain sympathies with neo-Nazi policies or activism. We see this in various different countries. In Hungary, for instance, there's been a huge kind of crackdown on far right militias as a way of excusing some of the more hard right articulations of the government and the populist far right articulations of the government. So I think it's very important not to kind of be caught up in those kind of distractions, and to look at the way in which the language of the war on terror, now with renewed focus on the far right, is being used and being replicated by states as a way of achieving their own ends.
Richard, just looking at the practicality of the research you did in Crimea, what are some of the challenges you face when you're trying to interview people who are being actively repressed?
It's really important, I think. This sort of speaks to another broader question within the field of research into terrorism and into extremism. It's a very fascinating field, because it's one of the few fields where there has been this assumption for a while, since its development, that actually if you go and you speak to terrorists, if you speak to people labeled terrorist or labeled extremist, actually what you do, you risk kind of ruining your work. You risk having it swayed by the views of extremists and terrorists, and you come out with something kind of not objective and which may kind of help to amplify their views and there has been this kind of traditional orthodox approach towards terrorism studies, where you've been encouraged not to engage with your subject, which I've always found very fascinating and tried to push back against. Now, thankfully, there's new scholars coming through who are very keen to go out and speak to those individuals, communities who have been labelled terrorists, labelled extremists, and understand those processes going on. And that's always been at the heart of my work. So I've worked with a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir in the UK, in Denmark. They're an Islamic activist group, one of the sort of the first groups in the 50s to come up with the idea of the re-establishment of an Islamic state. And of course, within the current context, particularly within the last 5 years, their work has been very problematized. They're a non-violent group, a non-violent Islamic group, very involved in activism, sort of having this very post-colonial critique, but grounded in Islamic language and grounded in the idea that the salve, the response to all of the Middle East's problems is to create a new Islamic state in a peaceful way. And of course, that kind of runs into discussions around concerns around Islamic State, the decline and fall of Islamic State, around jihadi violence and international violence. But they've been fascinating to talk to, really interesting to talk to, because they've been able to show how they've been responding to countering violent extremism, how they've been responding to new policy discussions, how they've been engaging with policymakers, with MPs, how they've been conducting lobbying, despite being an anti-democratic organization. Now, the work in Crimea also kind of formed a part of this, because Hizb ut-Tahrir had been operating in Crimea, and now since have been operating in the rest of Ukraine, but have been banned under Russian counter-terrorism legislation. So Russia has been using concerns around Hizb ut-Tahrir to clamp down on democracy. When talking to those individuals, talking to people who are involved in Crimean Solidarity and in pro-democracy movements who have been labelled extremists, been labelled terrorism, it's really important to make sure that you're doing it in an ethical way, making sure that you're protecting anonymity at every turn, making sure that there's no way that individuals can be implicated back into state security. And it's a very difficult thing. It takes a lot of time. It's also difficult to do those in democratic countries, in a democratic context, of course, because you're speaking with individuals who, you have to be careful in terms of what they say for their protection, and how you report it and how you use it. There's been instances of researchers having their research confiscated, working in a democratic and non-democratic context, having their research confiscated by authorities, facing risk by authorities. And actually, one of the things, in looking at all the kind of the ethics around this that obviously I have to do as part of my research, what I found most interesting is that a lot of the way in which risk and ethics are constructed is that there's concern that you might harm your subjects or that your subjects might harm you. Actually, a lot of the risk comes from authorities, both in democratic and non-democratic state. It comes from authorities and the fact that authorities might try to take your research, might try to find out who those individuals are, might put you at risk and might put those who you are interviewing at risk.
Richard, speaking of Hizb ut-Tahrir, one person that springs to mind in that context is Majid Nawaz, and he's become known as a former, as someone who's, changed sides or certainly repositioned themselves in terms of public discourse, and they're part of a seemingly larger or growing number of individuals, whether from the Muslim world or outside of it, from the far right and so on, who describe themselves as formers. They're former extremists, former radicals who've decided to take part in, countering violent extremism. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the matter of formers and their position within the industry. Are they valuable resources, or is this? How do you understand this phenomenon?
I personally think the role of formers is incredibly problematic. I take huge issue with the centralization of formers. Now, it's not. This isn't always a very popular opinion, but I really, I think a lot of, for all the good that potential formers might do, I think a lot of harm has been caused by their role within the development of counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism. So just picking up particularly on Majid Nawaz and Hizb ut-Tahrir. So Hizb ut-Tahrir, I focus on them as part of my PhD. I researched them in the UK and Denmark for my PhD. And I did so because I think they are an incredibly important chapter in the story of the development of counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism. Having been around for sort of 50 odd years prior to the start of the war on terror in sort of 2001, 2003, having worked in lots of different countries. And you have individuals such as Majid Nawaz and various other individuals who were part of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who, as part of the development of the war on terror at between the sort of the period 2005 to particularly 2008, essentially sort of flipped sides, if we can talk about sides. Essentially moved away very quickly from particularly Hizb ut-Tahrir. In 2008, a group of individuals moved away from Hizb ut-Tahrir and looked to start a response against terrorism, against concerns about terrorism and extremism. It's a very important story because a lot of those individuals who left Hizb ut-Tahrir, who, these sort of 6 to 8 individuals who got together in a living room in London and decided to leave HT and to go on to respond against their concerns against violent extremism. They've been very influential. Individuals such as Majid Nawaz, individuals such as Ed Hussein, such as Shiraz Meher, have formed a central component of a lot of the counter-extremism work that has gone on since, and have helped to develop this idea, particularly Majid Nawaz, helped to develop this idea that it's about, that terrorism is about, and extremism is about having certain ideas, and de-radicalization is about rejecting those ideas in favor of liberal democracy, certain values, national values within the UK, British values, liberal British democratic values. And that's essentially the sort of the antidote to violent extremism, to violence, and that notion has gained a lot of ground within the UK and then internationally, and helped to shape a lot of the de-radicalization work, the counter-extremism work, and has really helped to kind of push this idea that there are certain values that are safe, there are certain values that are extreme, values that particularly sit outside very kind of liberal accepted values, the status quo of the state, certain articulations of democracy, nothing too radical, but certain articulations of democracy and capitalism are the way in which we get rid of terrorism, the way in which we get rid of violence. There's so many problems, of course, with this that's led to the securitization of left-wing groups, led to the securitization of anti-fascist groups, and the problematization of work that's being done against fascism, it's led to a very kind of liberal conceptualization of how we respond, and this sort of the ability of this both side arguments to come to the fore that we've seen with Carr. And I think it's very important. I think their story needs to be told. There's more sort of publications and research that I'll be doing soon that will be coming out, looking at that process of development from this kind of group of individuals that split off from Hizb ut-Tahrir and help to drive a lot of the counter-terrorism and the counter-extremism, particularly the de-radicalization narrative forwards. I think formers occupy quite a high status, and certainly some of those individuals, such as Maajid Nawaz, immediately help to gain status by marketing themselves as being former extremists and former radicals, making kind of great play of what they're up to beforehand, and helping to drive their own ideas, or grinding their own axes within the context of a fast developing policy and new policies coming through, which really kind of took the lead from formers. So I think we have to be incredibly careful in ascribing former extremists this high role within the development of policy, within academia. We, of course, all know the direction that Maajid Nawaz has taken since COVID-19, but those of us who have had a critical eye on counter-terrorism and have been concerned about the development of terrorism saw exactly the same processes happening through Maajid Nawaz far earlier. And I think just, the COVID-19 crisis and the way in which he has certainly amplified some very concerning theories and statements on huge public platforms really is just another angle of concern that we have around formers such as Maajid Nawaz. So I think we have to be really careful with the role that we ascribe towards formers. I think there's been far too much lauding of their work. We need to put in the kind of the gritty groundwork, and we need to have a level of detachment from policy in order to kind of to understand what's going on and to understand processes around violence.
Richard, just finally, speaking of the novel coronavirus, you published some work towards the beginning of the pandemic looking at how far-right actors were responding to COVID-19 at that beginning and the different ways in which it was framed. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what you found through that research, and also have you seen a shift in the way that COVID-19 is framed by the far-right since you published that research?
Sure, absolutely. I think the research at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic that I did, looking at the far-right and the way in which the far-right are responding to COVID-19, was again it was born out of frustration of some of the discussions that I saw, particularly within policy, who kind of picked up on these ideas that the far right were using and very much grounded in misinformation. I remember, I don't know if you remember at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had these incredible statements sort of coming out from those involved in counter-terrorism policy and practice, saying that Nazis were going to sort of cough into spray bottles and run into synagogues and spray Jewish worshippers with the COVID virus, or that the far right was sort of targeting infrastructure and taking down 5G towers and these sorts of things. Now, it's such an interesting case study because the concern around counterterrorism was focused on the far right spreading the virus, but as we know in Europe, it wasn't the far right that was spreading the virus. It was actually the government that was doing a very good job of not particularly putting in very good responses towards COVID-19. Especially in the UK, you sort of saw some very sort of poor responses to the threat of the virus, whilst at the same time you're having language from prevent practitioners about the concerns of Nazis, running into synagogues and coughing. So I think that's a very interesting sort of tale and analogy about how the state views terrorism, and actually a lot of the concern that we need to think about really comes from the state in terms of the violence that it carries out. But also, it's very quickly there was this focus on misinformation in the far right, and actually what I was seeing, when I was hanging around on Telegram, when I was kind of looking at some of the statements that were coming out from far right. It wasn't so much focused on misinformation. Actually, a lot of the focus of the language, at least in the initial stages from the far right, was very much focused on where the government had gone wrong and why hadn't the government put in harder restrictions, and why is the government not tackling COVID-19 properly. And this was coming from far-right groups in all different countries in Europe that I was looking at. And this was very interesting because this was counter to the assumptions that we had, where even at the time we were thinking far-right groups were not interested in lockdown, they were interested in spreading misinformation. And there was an assumption within counter-terrorism and counter-terror communities that the far right just kind of wanted to spread pandemonium and wanted as much COVID as possible because it kind of creates chaos, without thinking that actually COVID-19 also created problems for far-right groups in terms of their activism as well. It also prevented their activists from coming together, and it showed the need for state responses and international responses to the spread of a virus and the spread of a pandemic. So I think it's really important to kind of make sure that we challenge some of the assumptions that we may instantly have about groups and about how they respond to different crises. And of course, with sort of various global crises that we have going on, it's very important to kind of critically reflect on how different groups are responding and challenge those assumptions by looking at what they're saying. In terms of response since, it's not, I haven't done an awful lot of research looking at kind of how those processes have changed, how far-right groups have changed. But I think it's really important that we make sure that we take assumptions, and particularly assumptions that are stated from government, from authorities, and challenge them and look into them and make sure that we have some kind of engagement with primary source material from those groups to sort of see how they're responding and how they're acting.
Well, Richard, I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to find you on Twitter, you are at McNeil-Willson. That's Neil with one L, Wilson with two. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic. It's been really nice to meet you both.
Well, Andy, that's all we've got time for. Global Intifada is up next. We'll catch you next week.
See you then.
Potem have a few children's picture books or footy boots that your kids have outgrown but want to find them a loving home? Well, drop them in at 3CR and put them in the Books and Boots bin. Books and Boots regularly sends pre-loved children's picture books and sports footwear to remote and regional First Nations communities and children across the country. Contact us at Books and Boots or go to the website www.booksandboots.org.au. We love a good book.